The child had not spoken since the night she arrived. She was perhaps a year old when they brought her, swaddled in a clean wool blanket that was too fine for a foundling, carried by a solicitor's clerk who handed her to Mrs. Pardoe with a sealed envelope, a quarterly payment schedule, and no name beyond the one written in the envelope's single line of instruction. She is to be called Rose. Nobody came after the clerk. Nobody wrote. The quarterly payments arrived with the punctuality of a professional obligation, drawn from a charitable trust with a Latin name that the orphanage's ledger-keeper entered without curiosity. Tutela Rosae, the guardianship of Rose. Had anyone thought to translate it, they might have found it an odd choice for an anonymous bequest. Too personal, too specific, too much like a private grief rendered in a dead language. Nobody translated it. Rose grew. She was a quiet child, not unhappy in any way that could be pointed to, but watchful in a manner that unsettled the matron's assistants and made the visiting parish ladies press their lips together and murmur about the peculiarities of foundlings. She had dark eyes that observed everything with a patience beyond her years, and she had learned early, as institutional children do, the precise economy of need. She did not ask for what would not be given. She did not reach for what would be withdrawn. She held herself at a careful distance from the world, and the world, after a while, stopped trying to cross it. That was the story everyone at Witchfield Orphanage told about Rose. What they did not know, because it had been arranged so that they could not, was that the trust funding her keep had been established at the direction of a woman who had spent 3 years making certain that a particular truth remained buried, and what that woman had not anticipated, in all her careful architecture of concealment, was the deathbed. Eugenia Trent died on a Sunday in October in a house in Bath that smelled of camphor and old ambition, with her eldest daughter seated beside her, and a secret she had carried for 3 years lodged in her chest, like a splinter too deep for ordinary extraction. She had managed it for a long while. She had almost, in certain seasons, believed her own version of events. But there is something about dying, about the specific, leveling quality of one's own ending, that dissolves the useful fictions a person has constructed against the truth. She told Cecily everything. Lady Cecily Trent sat in the chair beside her mother's bed and received the information with a stillness that, from the outside, might have resembled composure. It was not composure. It was the particular paralysis of a person whose understanding of the past 3 years has just been inverted entirely, who discovers, in the space of a few minutes, that the grief she has carried has a different shape than she believed, and that what she mourned as a death was in fact a theft. Her daughter had not died. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter was 2 years old and living in an orphanage in Derbyshire, and had been placed there by the woman now lying in this bed, who had told Cecily, with specific practiced detail, with the name of a physician and the hour of a false death, that the child had not survived 3 days. Cecily sat with this for a long time after her mother's breathing slowed. There was a letter, her mother told her at the last, in the desk, among the account books. It was addressed to Rose, folded twice, sealed with plain wax, in her mother's hand on the outside. For my granddaughter, to be given when she is old enough to understand. Inside, 4 lines. Your mother's name is Cecily Trent. She did not abandon you. She was told you had died, and she believed it because she had no reason not to. If you are reading this, then what was hidden has been found. Go find her. Cecily read it twice. She folded it, placed it inside her coat, and did not sleep for the remainder of that night. By morning she had made 2 decisions. The first was that she would go to Witchfield. The second was that she would find out who had been paying for her daughter's care, because her mother, who had managed, in this as in all things, to be simultaneously cruel and not entirely conscienceless, had arranged the funding through someone, and that someone had a name. It was in the account book, a reference to a solicitor's office in Derby, and a name in the margin in her mother's cramped hand, Ashmore. She sat with that name for some time as well. Edward Cavendish, Duke of Ashmore, was not a man Cecily had spoken of in 3 years. She had not permitted herself to speak of him, because speaking of the dead, and she had been told he was dead to her. In the way her mother managed such pronouncements, which was with a finality that precluded examination, required an energy she had not possessed. She had been told, in the weeks following her confinement and her daughter's supposed death, that the Duke had been informed of the situation and had removed himself from consideration, that he had not written, not come, not acknowledged the connection in any form, that she ought to consider the attachment concluded. She had considered it concluded. She had had no alternative. A woman in her position, unmarried, recently delivered of a child she had been told was dead, in a household managed entirely by her mother, had very limited avenues for independent investigation. Now, holding an account book in a dead woman's study, she understood that she had been managed on both sides. Her mother had not simply deceived her daughter. She had also, apparently, deceived the Duke. She could not yet fully account for why. She had 11 days to think about it on the road to Derbyshire. She arrived on a grey Thursday in November, stepping down from a hired carriage with a single trunk and a letter of introduction that described her as a benefactress of charitable inclination. It was the most useful untruth she had composed in years. She had learned the technique from her mother, which she found grimly appropriate. Mrs. Pardoe received her in the entrance hall with the measured warmth of a woman who has learned that quality benefactresses come with quality donations. She was a capable woman, weathered and observant, and she watched Lady Cecily's face with the particular attention of a person accustomed to reading what visitors do not say. "We have a number of children who would benefit greatly from," she began. "I should like to see the youngest ones first," Cecily said, with a pleasantness that did not invite negotiation, "if you don't mind." The receiving room was grey and cold, with a fire too modest for the space and small chairs arranged with institutional precision. Several children looked up when they entered. One did not. Rose was in the corner. She was sitting against the wall with a battered wooden spoon in her lap. Her particular comfort, Mrs. Pardoe would later explain, the one object she refused to be separated from, and she was looking at the floor with the concentrated stillness of a child who has learned not to expect much from arriving strangers. Her dark hair fell across her face. Her hands were still. Cecily stopped walking. It was the eyes, when the child finally looked up. Not their colour, though the colour was her own. It was the quality of attention in them, that particular, watchful steadiness that Cecily had spent 30 years believing was her own peculiarity. She saw it in this child's face and felt the recognition move through her like a physical thing. She crossed the room and crouched to the child's level. Rose studied her with the unhurried assessment of a 2-year-old who has learned to read adults very carefully before making any investment of trust. She looked at Cecily's face. She looked at her hands. Something in her small body, the set of her shoulders, the quality of her stillness, changed, almost imperceptibly, like a lock releasing. She reached out and placed one hand on Cecily's arm. It was not a word, it was not a name. She was 2 years old and had not spoken since her arrival, and her silence was not a mystery that resolved in an instant. But it was the first time in 13 months at Witchfield that Rose had voluntarily touched another person. Mrs. Pardoe, standing in the doorway, made a small sound that she quickly suppressed. Cecily covered the child's hand with her own and did not trust herself to speak. She spent 2 hours in that room. She did not announce herself. She did not say anything that was not the plain, ordinary language of a woman sitting with a child. Here is a fable, here is a picture. Here is a question about the wooden spoon that produced a minute but unmistakable response in the set of Rose's chin. She was learning the vocabulary of her daughter's silences, the particular gradations of a child who communicated in economy, because economy was all she had been given room for. It was slow, careful work, and Cecily was very good at slow, careful work. She had been practicing patience for 3 years. It was nearly 4 o'clock when the outer door opened. She heard Mrs. Pardoe's bearing change before she heard the footsteps. The matron's voice shifting register into the professional deference reserved for significant visitors. Heavy steps in the passage, unhurried. The steps of a man who does not generally find it necessary to hurry. The receiving room door opened. She had not seen him in 3 years. She had not expected to see him here, though some part of her, the part that had spent the 11-day carriage ride composing and discarding explanations, had known, with a low, certain dread, that the name in her mother's account book made this encounter eventually inevitable. She had not expected it to be today. He was taller than memory had rendered him, or perhaps memory had reduced him to a manageable size, as it does with things too large to carry at full weight. The Duke of Ashmore stood in the doorway and looked at Cecily Trent across the grey receiving room, and his face did the thing she had not seen it do in all the years she had known him. It went, for a fraction of a second, entirely unguarded. Then it closed again. "Lady Trent," he said. His voice betrayed nothing. "Your Grace," she said, and rose from the floor with the careful precision of a woman who will not be caught disadvantaged. Rose, disturbed by the change in Cecily's posture, looked up. She looked at the man in the doorway with the same unhurried assessment she had applied to Cecily 2 hours earlier. Whatever she made of what she found, she did not recoil. She pressed slightly closer to Cecily's side. "She spoke, my lady, Mrs." Pardoe was addressing Cecily but watching the Duke with confused attention. "Earlier, when you arrived, she held my hand," Cecily said, carefully. "She permitted me near. That is sufficient progress for one day." Mrs. Pardoe accepted this with a slight frown. She looked between her two visitors with the expression of a woman assembling a picture from pieces she has not been given in the correct order. "You are acquainted," she said. "We have met," the Duke said. "We are acquainted," Cecily said, simultaneously. The inadequacy of both answers hung in the cold air. The Duke looked at her steadily. She looked back. 3 years of unspoken accusation and unspoken loss arranged themselves in the space between them and held their breath. He asked to speak with her privately. "Mrs." Pardoe's office was small and cold, its single window facing the moorland. A fire had been laid, but not yet lit. Neither of them moved to light it. "You came for the child," the Duke said. A statement in the form of a question. "Yes." "You knew she was here." He was watching her with the focused attention of a man who has learned, at some cost, to read beneath the surface of conversations. "Your letter of introduction described a charitable call, but you came directly to her. You did not require a tour of the establishment." "No." He waited. Cecily had made her decision in the carriage, in the long, cold miles of moorland road. She reached inside her coat and placed 2 items on the desk between them. The letter her mother had written to Rose and the page from the account book. He read them both. His jaw tightened once, in the way she remembered, the only visible signal of an interior movement too large for the ordinary channels of expression. He set them down. "Your mother?" he said. "Yes." Then, "I was told the child was a foundling, a housemaid's infant, deceased mother, no known connections. I was told the anonymous benefactor who had initiated the arrangement required a trustworthy vehicle for the child's care, and that my trust had been recommended." He paused. "I was told nothing else. I was given no name, no origin, no reason. I accepted the arrangement because—" He stopped, reconsidered, "because something about it seemed necessary. I could not account for it logically. I did not examine it too closely." "You were her father," Cecily said. "Something in you may have known before your mind did." The word father did to him what she had expected it to do. He sat down. She watched the Duke of Ashmore, who had never, in all her knowledge of him, betrayed a moment of physical unsteadiness, place both hands flat on the desk surface and breathe twice with the slow deliberation of a man managing something enormous in a confined space. "She is mine," he said. "Not a question. She is ours. I was delivered of a daughter in May of 1812, in circumstances my mother managed from beginning to end, and kept from both of us with considerable efficiency. I was told the child died within 3 days. I was told separately that you had been informed of my condition and had considered the attachment impractical." She held his gaze. "I now understand that you were told something equivalent about me. Different details, same conclusion. My mother was a very organized woman." His expression, when he looked up, was not the controlled blankness she had expected. It was something older than that. The face of a man confronting simultaneously a loss he had not known to mourn, and a grief he had been managing under the wrong name. "I was told you had gone abroad," he said. a Tuscan arrangement made quickly, that you had concluded the attachment was unsuitable and had not wished for correspondence. His voice was very quiet. I believed it because I had no reason not to. And because, he stopped again in the manner of a man not accustomed to completing sentences of this kind, because refusing to believe it would have required acting on the doubt, Cecily said. And acting on a doubt you cannot prove is humiliation offered freely. He looked at her. Yes. I did not go to Tuscany, she said. I spent 3 years in Wiltshire in my mother's second house, having concluded an attachment I was told was over. She kept her voice level. We were managed on both sides, Your Grace, by a woman who understood exactly what each of us would accept without investigation. The silence between them was different now. Still weighted, still unresolved, but differently shaped. Two people sorting through the same inventory of lost time, finding it heavier than either had expected. She cannot stay here, Cecily said finally. No, I intend to make the formal application as her mother of record. My mother's letter provides the identification, and I can produce the relevant documents from the Bath household. She paused. The question of her legal situation will be complex. I do not intend to let that complexity delay her removal from this place. It will not. His voice had steadied. She watched him recollect himself, with the focused deliberateness of a man who is not yet at the end of what he can manage, but is applying considerable effort to staying ahead of it. I have legal counsel in Derby. Whatever documentation is required, it will be prepared correctly. Quickly, she said. Correctly and quickly, he said, and something in his voice, something very faint, barely audible, was almost a different register than the past hour had allowed. Not warmth, precisely, but the memory of it. She did not respond to it directly. She was not ready to respond to it. There was too much unexamined ground between them, too much that would need to be said slowly, and without the pressure of a cold office and a child waiting in the next room. She had learned, at considerable cost, what careless speed produced, but she did not look away either. The formal arrangements took 11 days. 11 days of parish officials and county records, and one magistrate, who questioned the sequence of events with a thoroughness Cecily found both irritating and entirely appropriate. She answered everything steadily. She had waited 3 years. 11 days was a minor imposition. The Duke appeared on the second morning with documents, not with his title deployed as a lever. She had half expected that, and had prepared for it, but with carefully prepared legal work that addressed each requirement in order. She read through everything and found it sound. She did not tell him that his restraint moved her more than expedience would have. She wrote him a brief note of acknowledgement, professional and correct, and reminded herself that they were at the beginning of something that would need to be built slowly or not at all. Rose, during the 11 days, began to speak, not in declarations, not in the catharsis of a child whose silence suddenly breaks. Her voice came in the careful, incremental way of something very long unused. Small words at first, a yes, a no, a plain statement of want or observation. She said spoon on the 4th day, in the context of holding her wooden spoon and confirming its existence to Cecily in a tone that brooked no disagreement. She said cold on the 7th, as a statement of fact regarding the receiving room's temperature. She said your name on the 9th, seated in Cecily's lap and looking up at her with those watchful eyes, and when Cecily answered her she repeated it once, carefully, as though storing it precisely where it belonged. Mrs. Pardoe, witnessing this, wept briefly and professionally in her office. Rose came home on a Thursday. 11 days after Cecily's arrival, she was lifted into a carriage with her wooden spoon and a small parcel of things the matron had assembled with unexpected tenderness. A hair ribbon, a picture book, a pair of wool stockings in good repair. She looked out the window as the carriage moved away from Wychfield's limestone facade, and her expression was not grief and not relief, but something more settled than either. The look of a child who has been waiting for a particular thing and has now received it and is in the process of taking the full weight of it in. The Duke rode alongside. Cecily watched him through the window, his profile composed and forward-facing, his bearing its familiar authority, which she had once found formidable, and now understood differently. It was not coldness. It had never been coldness. It was the architecture a person constructs when they have learned that the things they love can be taken without warning, and that the world will not pause to acknowledge the loss. Rose, following her gaze, studied the man on the horse. "Who is he?" she asked. Her voice was still learning the dimensions of its own existence. Cecily looked at her daughter's face, and at the man outside, and felt the weight of everything. The 3 lost years, the false grief, the 2 people who had been kept from each other with such surgical precision by someone who had understood them both too well. "He has been caring for you," Cecily said. "From a distance, for as long as you have been here. He did not know you were his, but he cared for you regardless." Rose considered this with the seriousness of a child to whom incomplete information is preferable to comfortable untruth. "Does he know now?" "Yes." "Good," Rose said with the finality of a 2-year-old who has reviewed the facts and issued a verdict, and went back to her spoon. Outside, the moors extended to the grey horizon, vast and unhurried, as they always are with the human arrangements conducted within them. It had taken too long. Cecily did not intend to soften that truth, or arrange it into something more bearable. 3 years of separation, of grief misdirected and love, kept at a careful distance from its proper object. That was not a wound that closed in a carriage ride or an office interview, or even in the long, deliberate months that followed, during which she and the Duke began, with the patience of people who understand what haste costs, to speak honestly to one another for the first time. But Rose was in the carriage with her spoon, and her new voice, and her particular quality of attention that watched the world and found it, provisionally, worth watching. And sometimes in the evenings, Cecily would take the letter from her mother's desk and read it again. Not the 4 lines written to Rose, but the act of the letter itself. The fact that a woman capable of such meticulous cruelty had also been incapable of letting the child have nothing, had preserved in secret wax and careful handwriting the one piece of information that might one day undo the whole arrangement. It did not make Cecily forgive her, but it meant that even in the architecture of the deception, a door had been left. Not open, not obvious, but there, unlocked, waiting. She had found it. They had all, in their various ways, found one another. The rest of it, the slow, imperfect, necessary work of what comes after, was simply the life that follows when the waiting is finally done, which, as it turned out, was quite sufficient.